And what makes me optimistic is knowing that humans have a lot of gifts. Every human has the gift of thought, the gift of agency, the gift of action. And that if you set goals, if these are meaningful goals and they're goals which are related to your passions in life or your interests and related to your skills and talents, you can go on to meet those goals. And that makes me optimistic. Hope and optimism can be independent of circumstances, and it is a kind of human, being aware of this human gift of agency. Surround yourself by hope-inspiring people. There are people in the world who bring that optimism, who bring that level of hope into your life and into their surroundings.
It's Victor Perton here, and welcome to the Optimism Cafe at the Centre for Optimism. And today I am delighted to welcome Rob Whitley, who's a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at McGill University. And a lovely coincidence as we talk from Canada to Australia, he is also a Principal Fellow at the University of Melbourne, but this year, because of COVID, hasn't been able to visit us. Welcome, Rob.
Hello, Victor. Thank you for having me, and hello to everybody out there in Australia and beyond.
It's a delight to have you. The first question we always ask in the Centre for Optimism is what makes you optimistic? So, Rob, may I ask you what makes you optimistic?
I think we need to start off by defining some terminology. And I always say that many people conflate the words optimism with the word hope. And there's a slight difference. And I think it's important to actually consider that difference. So when we talk about optimism, it's generally in relation to expectations, in relation to the future, in relation to setting goals and meeting those goals. And in relation to that aspect of optimism, what makes me optimistic is knowing that humans have a lot of gifts. Every human has the gift of thought, the gift of agency, the gift of action. And that if you set goals, if these are meaningful goals and they're goals which are related to your passions in life or your interests and related to your skills and talents, you can go on to meet those goals. And that makes me optimistic. Another thing that makes me optimistic is surrounding myself by what I call hope-inspiring people. There are millions of people in the world, and some of those people in our social networks, in our families, kind of inspire optimism and inspire hope and believe in you and give you that nudge which many of us need to set goals and meet goals. But just going back to my original point, there's a slight difference between optimism and hope that I'd like to talk about, which is that optimism is particularly related to the future, but many philosophers and theologians have talked about hope, and they've said that hope is independent of circumstances, but hope can also relate to the past and the present, that we can have hope for the past. Now, that sounds paradoxical maybe to some people, but what that means is that you might be living in a particularly difficult situation now. I'm old enough to remember when I was young in my 20s, kind of being lonely, living in a bedsit, not having much, thinking that the future was bleak and I wasn't achieving all my goals in life, and I was moving slowly through university. But now when I look back on that time of life, I find it was a real character building experience. And I have kind of the hope for the past. Yeah. So when we talk about hope for the past, I think that's an important element to consider in this kind of wider conversation about optimism, that optimism and hope, these two related concepts, can relate to the future, can also relate to the present and the here and now, and also can relate to the past things which have happened in your life. And so that's a kind of long answer and a tangential answer to your question, I think.
You're almost going to draw me down that rabbit burrow, because I wrote an article last week on hope and optimism, because as you say, a lot of theologians, including the current Pope, sort of poo-poo optimism and encourage a belief in hope. Although in the case of the Pope, I picked up a couple of speeches he'd made in Asia, so maybe a different speechwriter, where he had said to young people, be optimistic. But generally there's this argument that appears in some of the Catholic and Orthodox churches saying, well, don't be optimistic, that's a mere human thing, be hopeful. Have you looked at that? I mean, you look at a lot of spiritual work. So my view is you can be both hopeful and optimistic. You don't need to make a choice.
Yes, and I think the discussion goes deeper and even further back into history than that. So, for example, the national anthem of Israel is Hativka, and that word in Hebrew means hope. And that is now the national anthem of Israel. But before the modern state of Israel existed, that was like a folk song within the Jewish community, which was exceedingly popular throughout the ages, despite the fact that Jews across the world have faced terrible anti-Semitism, have faced the Holocaust, have faced exile in Babylon, and lots of other terrible circumstances. And I think the idea is that hope is something that's divine, something that's very deep, something that's meaningful. Like I said, something that kind of transcends uh, the time span of an individual problem, an individual issue, even the time span of an individual life. We can have hope, which goes way beyond the course of our 70 and 10 on the in this world. And as we all get older, some of us are thinking of the next generation and the generation after that. And this overlaps with kind of wisdom of Aboriginal people who are often talking about, let's think about the seventh generation and let's have hope for that generation and take our actions today to ensure that they're living a good life. Um, and there is a bit of a parallel belief, which I do believe is a false dichotomy, that kind of like you said, optimism is a more earthly characteristic, and it's often used uh, in a couplet when people talk about blind optimism or false optimism or kind of saccharine optimism. And that's an easy way to invalidate a concept. People talk about blind faith, and but what about just faith? Like, what about just optimism? And like I said, optimism is important to keep you going on this life. And we do know that there's slings and arrows of outrageous fortune happening to everybody in the world, regardless of your socioeconomic status or your race or ethnicity or your gender. That it is difficult to be a human, and we face challenges, and we have barriers to our progress. And it's good to think about the arrow of time and the arrow of your life, and that there are things happening for you as an individual, there are things happening for your family, for your community, and for wider humanity. And today, this year, this decade, in the 70 and 10 and more that hopefully we're allotted in life, and also longer than that. So I think they're both useful concepts, hope and optimism. And kind of like I said at the beginning, it is useful to disentangle them and think about them. And individuals can do that as well and think about how it applies to their life.
No, brilliant, brilliant. And that straw man concept, unrealistic optimism or outrageous optimism rather than what we foster, which is realistic optimism. Now, you are a prolific writer. There's so many articles. You're looking at men's health, you're looking at spirituality, you're looking at recovery. And I saw a wonderful article the other day about the ultra-aged active people over 100, who remain active in public life. The two traits are purpose and optimism. So tell us about your work and research and what drives you, Rob.
Yeah, sure. I think when we look at, I work in the discipline of psychiatry. And when we look at the discipline of psychiatry now, it's driven a lot by biological research that is looking at factors like genetics, it's looking at factors like pharmaceutical interventions, it's looking at factors like neuroscience. But if we go back a few decades, the discipline of psychiatry had 1 foot in the humanities and 1 foot in the biological sciences, and now it has kind of 2 feet or 1 3/4 foot in the sciences and a tiny bit in the humanities. And I feel we've really lost something. And what drives me is trying to bring that kind of back to the conversation of mental health, because there's a huge amount of research, social science research, research from religion, research from sociology, anthropology, other disciplines, showing that meaning and purpose are two of the key factors that are completely relevant to all aspects of mental health. They've been shown to be a lack of meaning and purpose can be a risk factor for suicide. It can be a risk factor for depression. We know that having meaning and purpose can be a factor that allows people to flourish and thrive in life. And I feel there is an existential void for many people in society today. The societies most people live in have become consumerist societies, have become individualistic societies. If we look at just some basic statistics here in Canada, 1 in 3 households in Canada are single person households. The divorce rate is 40%. the rate of membership of organizations that bring people together, such as churches, synagogues, trade unions, fraternal organizations, sports clubs. The rate of membership of these organizations has declined precipitously over the last 20 years. This is not even to mention COVID-19. So we find a lot of people living an atomized life, living an individualistic life. And we do know that these are risk factors for mental illness and risk factors for suicide. And we do know, on the contrary, that being a part of a community, being part of a family, having that kind of social support can be really helpful for your mental health if you're embedded in a network of people who love you and care about you. And where these communities like churches and synagogues, places of worship, where it's more than just the sum of the parts, where the people are coming together and there's meaning outside of yourself. There's a phrase that Jonathan Sacks, a famous English rabbi, sadly passed away recently, said that you're more than a letter in a scroll, a letter in a scroll. That your life as a letter is meaningless unless it's in a word, unless that word is in a sentence, and that sentence is in a paragraph. So for me, it's important to bring this debate about meaning and purpose and to teach this to our young people and older people as well, and for people to really find that, and because that is linked to good mental health, and I feel it's really important to put that message out there.
Absolutely brilliant. Now, last week you wrote a wonderful article on the Serenity Prayer, and you concluded the Serenity Prayer is optimistic about the human condition, encouraging individuals to think deeply and act with resolution in the here and now, rather than wallowing in a fatalistic worldview. What's special about the Serenity Prayer?
Well, I feel I should just read the Serenity Prayer first, because perhaps not all the listeners are familiar with this prayer, and give a bit of an introduction. So the Serenity Prayer was written in the 1930s by Reinhold Niebuhr, who was an American theologian, and he wrote it right in the middle of the Great Depression in the 1930s, when Nazism was increasing in Germany and fascism in Italy, communism in Russia, and the world was in a bit of a crisis. And it was a prayer that was trying to bring some kind of hope to the world, and to get people to focus their attention, and almost to kind of grow up and to realize that the world is something that is a gift from God, and we have agency to be able to act upon that gift. And I'll just briefly read the prayer. So the prayer goes like this: Lord, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So this prayer is in three parts. The first sentence: God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. What I say in more slang terms is that this is a reality check, that every human has their own limitations, personal limitations. We also live in a society which has laws, and we have limitations in our family household or within our jurisdiction about what we can do or what we can't do. So in this COVID-19 situation here in Canada, all the pubs are closed, at least in my province in Quebec. All the restaurants are closed. We can't go and visit people in their family, in their households, unless they live with you. That is something we cannot change, and we need to approach that with serenity, which means an inner peace, a calmness, and this is important to deal with this current situation. The second sentence is courage to change the things that I can. This is a very liberating sentence as far as I'm concerned, because it says that we are humans, we have agency. There are many things we are able to change. Even in this COVID-19 situation, we can start engaging in new hobbies. We can rekindle old interests. We have this great gift of the internet, where I can talk to somebody in Australia and reach a new audience, which is wonderful. I can talk to my other colleagues in Australia and my colleagues in the UK and in Europe. Um, I can engage in introspection and reflection in this COVID-19 situation. Maybe it's a time to rethink my life priorities, what I've been doing, how I've been contributing to the world, how I've been working as a colleague or friend or family member. So there are many things that we can change even in this COVID-19 situation. And the Serenity Prayer directs us to think about those things. And like I said in my article, we shouldn't really be wallowing in self-pity. I can't speak for everybody, but I'm lucky to be a healthy person. and have my have a job and have some income. So there's things that I can change, and I'm grateful for that. And I'm out there thinking about how I can do this. The final sentence of the Serenity Prayer, the wisdom to know the difference. Again, that encourages us to be reflective, to be deep thinkers, to think about our lives, what we can change, what we can't change, to strive for wisdom. And again, that's a word we don't really use a lot in society, and especially in my own discipline of psychiatry here. A lot of these words that have gone out of fashion, I feel we need to start thinking about and reincorporating back into our lives. Words like wisdom, words like hope, words like meaning, words like purpose, words like existence. We've replaced them with all these trendy psychological words like self-esteem and self-efficacy and this and that. But I think we can really learn from these kind of philosophers and theologians who've really thought deeply about these issues. And the Serenity Prayer, I feel, is a really good way to focus our thoughts on the situation that we're in, how we can change the situation, and how we can be a positive catalyst for others and for our society.
Yeah, it's one of the things that does underpin an optimistic environment is both prayer and singing. You know, I think there's evidence out of the United States that the optimism of what they call the Black community, they're actually more optimistic than the general community, even though all of the problems of Black Lives Matter and the like, because they have a greater sense of spirituality, larger families, and this culture of singing, whether it's spiritual or modern rap, it must have something to do with their optimism.
It's interesting you say that, actually, because another concept I often look at is resilience. And when you look at the African American community in the US, they have lower rates of suicide, they have lower rates of depression. Their generic mental health is typically better than a non-African American person. And some people think this is an enigma, or this is a paradox, because, like you said, that there's been a lot of racism in the US, and kind of has been many issues in the past year, as we know, and way before that. But I actually spent 5 years conducting a research study with a group of African Americans in Washington, D.C. And one thing that struck me in that research study, some of the key findings we found were that, first of all, very high rates of religiosity, that kind of hope that I talked about back at the beginning of this call, which is hope kind of greater than for things greater than yourself, and this kind of long-term view of hope. Friendship networks. So we find African American community much more common to have larger families, more brothers and sisters. Your children often raised by your mother or your father if you have to go off to work, or your older sister or an aunt, rather than being dumped at a daycare for 10 hours a day for 5 days a week to be raised by a group of strangers. We see less individualism in a way, less striving for the rat race, and to have a bigger car and to have a bigger house, and a more kind of acceptance of living a life beyond all that material wealth. So there are many variables, and it's exactly as you say. It's a very interesting community to look at, because it's a bit of a paradox or an enigma in a way, that the suffering that they've experienced, and it just shows to show that hope and optimism can be independent of circumstances, and it is a kind of human, being aware of this human gift of agency.
We in my family, the older generation is now dying. My mother died 8 weeks ago. Her brother died a year, or they're in the 90s. No, but they lived through World War II. They were refugees 2 or 3 times. You know, they were at risk of death many times, and yet they lived through to their 90s as infectiously optimistic, always smiling, always cheering other people up. And, you know, so it is interesting that sort of Nietzschean notion of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. To some extent, it also makes you more optimistic in many cases. Now, how do you keep yourself optimistic, Rob? What are your secrets for your optimistic and purposeful life?
I think there are 3 main factors. First off, like I said, surround yourself by hope-inspiring people. There are people in the world who bring that optimism, who bring that level of hope into your life and into their surroundings. And that can be infectious. I'm not a great believer in the law of attraction, but there is something to be said for it in terms of if you have people around you who are positive, who are getting things done, who are moving forward, that can really help you. And that is actually a kind of theory in social sciences now. There's a theory called spoking. I've heard about it recently, that it's like the wheel of a bicycle has spokes. And if you've got a spoke which is in danger of breaking, if you've got other good spokes around you, then that can help take the weight, and that spoke can get back to normal. And I'm sure any physicist watching this will be questioning my explanation here, but I'm sure the viewers can get what I mean. So that's one factor. I think a second factor is exactly as I said earlier, conduct meaningful, purposeful activities that is kind of beyond yourself and outside of your own self-aggrandizement. So this could be volunteering, it could be kind of writing, producing, whatever your gifts are, making cakes and giving them to a home for senior people down the road, or it could be helping out in a place of worship where they're helping out in a youth club, for example. I think having that sense of meaning and purpose beyond yourself is very important. And I think a third thing, you talked about singing earlier, hobbies and activities. Exercise for many people is a massive one that can bring good mental health. We do know that that's related to serotonin, and it's also related to psychosocial aspects of feeling good about yourself. But there's as many hobbies in the world as there are people. We can think about playing a musical instrument, arts and crafts, cooking, baking, Australia, surfing and swimming, and all these wonderful things you can do down there. And to have that kind of sense of an internal self and an external self where you're looking after yourself, but then that allows you to go out and look after others and contribute towards the community. And then when those are combined, that makes you feel good and optimistic about the future, and hopeful about life and the community that you live in.
That's fantastic. And so tips and tricks for Christmas and New Year. So Melbourne, we're lucky. We had the longest lockdown of anyone. My children were studying from home from April till October.
Wow.
You're in lockdown now. So coming into Christmas, coming into the new year, what would you advocate that the average person looking at this, trying to become more optimistic? We've got a course called the 14 Habits of an Optimist. You can't take on 14 habits. What would you say as you're reflecting over Christmas, New Year? What's the best way for someone to pick up one habit or one trick for becoming more optimistic, more purposeful, and to emulate the things you referred to?
I think one thing that everybody can do, which has been proven to be beneficial, is setting goals and then meeting those goals. And these can be a series of really short steps, or they can be medium-sized steps, or they can be giant leaps. The Christmas period lasts, we have what, 4 weeks left, more or less, 3 weeks. It can be tough for many people. Some people live alone. They won't be able to see their family. Many people are immigrants, won't be able to travel outside of their jurisdiction. It's for many people, it's a religious celebration that should be celebrated in congregation with their fellow congregants, and that will not be able to happen in many places. So I think kind of setting some kind of goals, meeting those goals. Talked to somebody recently, and they said they've been having a tough time. They're unemployed. They've been laying in bed a lot of the day, sleeping. For them, a goal is simply getting out of bed earlier, going to the grocery store, buying some fresh vegetables and food, and then cooking that instead of eating kind of pre-cooked meals. For other people, the year 2020 might have brought about a lot of reflection and introspection, and they might be thinking, well, a goal over this Christmas period is to, maybe I'm thinking of a career change, and I'm going to read some books and some websites and talk to some people about, is this feasible, or is this something that I want to do? For other people, younger people or older people, maybe they feel that it is a time to re-engage with education. I just spoke on the phone actually earlier today with someone who contacted me and said they're thinking of going back to university. Someone who dropped out, and would I write them a reference? And I said, yeah, of course, I'd be delighted to help you in that process. And I said, well, you should also engage in some hard thinking over the Christmas period. Are you ready? Are you ready to do the hard work, the reading, the exams? Um, there's um, a lot of hard work involved in being a student or making a career change, or some of these things that I'm talking about. So over this period, the big step doesn't have to be I'm going to resign from my job and apply and get a new job. Big step can just be like thinking about things, taking some action, intermediate action in terms of thinking about where you're going and what you're going to do, and then meeting those things. So I would encourage everybody, just if they're struggling in particular, to kind of set some goals for this Christmas period, things that they'd like to do, which are meaningful to them, and then go out and try and meet them. And when January comes and a new year, it's a new start for everybody. It's a time of renewal. Hopefully people can go forward and do something useful.
So you're saying that there's little stuff, just cooking with vegetables more. At the other end, there's that change of career. And so it doesn't need, Norman Vincent Peale used to say, when you pray, do big prayers. But what you're saying is little, big, it doesn't matter, do something.
I would say it's important to lay out a plan of action, to have even if it's a plan of action, which are very minor actions, which can be going at a glacial pace. Um, it's a cliche, but it's actually a saying that has a lot of value. That the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. But also to remember that this can involve hard work, and are you prepared for the hard work? So um, if you think about even something as simple as the first example I gave, it's going to be hard for this person to go to the grocery store because the person I'm talking about has agoraphobia, doesn't really like being in crowds, is worried about COVID-19. And that's going to require resilience, getting yourself into the right mindset, thinking about gearing up for that actual interaction. But how good will that feel when you get back and you've achieved that goal? So set some goals, big ones, small ones, medium-sized ones, try and meet them. If you can't meet them, don't beat yourself up, but use it as a learning experience. And then when the new start comes in 2021, you can try something similar.
Yeah, look, I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours, and I hope we can invite you back. There's one other thing I wanted to ask you. One of sort of the members of the Centre for Optimism, Martin Gillespie's, doing a lot of work for men. And in Australia, and I suspect Canada the same, the increase in depression, anxiety, most suicides are men. You're doing quite a body of research on that. What's your research finding, and what can we do both to use your learnings, but also to support what you're doing, Rob?
Well, I conducted a research study which recently ended on a community known as the seduction community. Now, I'm not sure if everybody's aware what that community is. They're also known as pickup artists. So there's basically an underground community of men that exists in all Western countries, and I know they exist in Australia. They're young men who watch YouTube channels that have 1 million subscribers. They go on Reddit forums, which have 500,000 subscribers. They meet together in person in someone's house or in a bar. And on paper, the aim of this community, which is called the seduction community, is to learn techniques and mindsets that help people help men have sex with women. I did a 2-year study of men in this community where I got to know them. I did interviews, I attended some of the meetings. And what I actually found was that the vast majority of men in that community, or not all of them, it certainly wasn't, that sex and meeting women was not the prime motivator. What was a motivator was that many of these men felt an existential vacuum in their life. They lacked role models. Many of them had been raised by single mothers and hadn't had much contact with their father, so they hadn't had any positive masculine influence in their lives. Many of them were immigrants and they felt very lonely and didn't understand the social mores in the host culture. Many of them were looking for friends. Many of them were looking for guidance. Many of them were looking for ideas about mental health, that some of them had mental health issues. It's a long way of saying that nature abhors a vacuum.
Yeah.
So what I'm finding in men's mental health is that the official services that are provided by hospitals, by mental health clinics, by government-funded services, are not meeting the needs of men with mental health issues. And instead, men are flocking to these alternative, somewhat unsavory communities like the seduction community, because they see that as a more hospitable, more welcoming, and a more male-tailored community to help them with their mental health. And we can think about many of these communities. We can think about, I don't know, Hell's Angels, or extreme right organizations or extreme left organizations, which men are kind of flocking to, that they're kind of looking for hope. They're looking to fill their time with something meaningful. And I fear that we as a society, I don't think we failed, but I think we can certainly try and help men. How we can help men by creating similar communities which are based on kind of positive, pro-social, community-oriented values. So my recent big finding is kind of that I feel that, you know, there is a vacuum in men's mental health. I feel in Australia is actually one of the places where it's pioneering a lot of work on men's mental health. So if you think about men's sheds, if you think about Movember funded initiatives, the Australian Men's Health Foundation is well known across the world. But here in Canada, at least, there's a huge vacuum. Men are instead flocking to these kind of unsavory communities. And instead of blaming men for doing this, we should look at the whys. And the why is that many of them, like I said back in the middle of this conversation, there's fewer people going to church or going to places of worship. There's more broken families. There's fewer people have cousins and aunts and uncles, because we have smaller families who can help shape them. And I feel that men, and young men in particular, can really feel that lack of guidance, and we need to do something to fill that.
That's fascinating, because you think, you know, Rotary and Lions clubs and the like, you know, men in all communities used to join them. And, you know, they've really declined. And as you say, they're joining these alternative organizations. One of the things that you know, I have teenage children, and humor has changed. So I'm 62. And when I was young, you could tell any joke at all, you know, racist, sexist, and the like. And it seems to me that, you know, all of those, if I tell one of those jokes now, the kids will look at me as if I'm some sort of neo-Nazi, some sort of alt-right. So you can't tell those. So maybe 2/3 of our jokes have disappeared. And the alternative humor we're seeing is this American, you know, US style humor, very caustic, this sort of put down humor. And one of the things I've been interested in is what's the replacement good humor? You know, the stuff that makes people laugh. You know, our second habit of the optimist is laugh like an optimist, laugh every day. You can't tell the jokes that have been joke telling. So, you know, Jews tell the best jokes about Jews. The Irish tell the best jokes about Irish. Typically, we've had that body of humor. What's replacing it, if anything?
Well, I think there's a wider issue there, which is kind of transgenerational interaction that we are not having in this society. And this COVID-19 situation has really amplified that. We're not having enough positive interaction between the generations. I feel like you said, your family, you said, were refugees from Europe from the communists and the Nazis. My father lived in Nazi-occupied Europe. Spent 5 years of his life fearful of the German soldiers around him and not knowing if this occupation would ever end. And we have many people who have survived the Holocaust, who have survived very tough times in Australia. There, Vietnamese boat people, there's a big community in Australia who have survived these terrible ideologies in Cambodia and in Vietnam and places. Many of these people are now older, like 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, but I feel there's not enough. We're not learning enough from people like that. The younger people are not learning enough, and I'm not blaming the younger people. I'm just blaming maybe the way the education system is set up, or the way society is evolving over time, because we could learn so much from people who have, like you say, they've gone through very tough times. They've survived and they've come and they've thrived. Many have come to a third country like Australia or Israel or Canada, and they've built societies, they've contributed to their communities, and they've lived through crises way worse than COVID-19.
Yeah.
And I feel it's really important to harness the wisdom of people who have lived through these periods as community educators, and to go into schools, go into universities, go to youth clubs, and go to other places and talk about this. And this relates to my original point about having hope for the past. At the time of their lives when they were experiencing this, this was a hell which people wanted to escape from. And now that's given them wisdom and character that they can now use to help the new generations. So I feel there is it's one thing that we any organization like yours, or any we as a society need to harness better, which is the wisdom of our elders, and which has long been known to the Aboriginal people of Australia and Canada. But we've kind of in our own Anglo-Celtic kind of cultures, we tend to think, well, people are old, let's just ship them off to an old people's home a couple of 100 miles away and visit them once a week. And we're not tapping into their wisdom as much as we should.
If I can share two things, yes, on the first point, the Aboriginality, we actually got a project which we haven't started yet, but we've just been scoping, called Optimism 2.0, you know, which would merge Western notions or global notions of optimism with Indigenous knowledge. So I'll keep you in the loop on that as that develops, because that's quite exciting. But the other thing we did was the Nelson Mandela Youth Leadership Summit, which has traditionally been in a dusty hall in Shepparton, which is a regional city in Australia. And this year, because of COVID, we had to bring it online. Well, the numbers increased fivefold with children from Denver to Denmark. But we also took the risk of our working groups being done at random. So we had a CEO from a medtech company in San Diego interacting with 16-year-olds from regional Australia. And the feedback from both the 16-year-olds and the 60-year-old was that they were both blown away by the knowledge of the other, and that mixing, as you say, of old and young, of wisdom and passion and energy was so fantastic.
I think that's a great point. And in my previous answer, I didn't make it clear that the exchange of wisdom goes both ways. That we know kind of 16, 17, 18-year-olds, many of them have not been polluted by kind of life experience or by excessive exposure to negative media coverage of all the events in the world, or had been in the workforce where they've become burnt out or cynical, like some people who are older happens to. So it is wonderful to mix together that kind of energy and that kind of optimism, and people who have time on their side, put them together with people who have had most of their time and are reflective upon it and want to pass on their wisdom. It's a great cocktail. And I really think that mixing the generations together is good for the mental health and the well-being of both the young people, the old people, the people in between. And that's what families used to do.
Yeah.
And I feel it's sad that it's people's choice, so we have to respect people's choice. But I don't know about your family, Victor, but I probably have 10 aunts and uncles, and when I was younger, Christmas was a time where lots of people were coming here. Grandparents were alive, and cousins, and this and that. And now people have much smaller families. So many people don't have any siblings, so they're only child. So when Christmas comes, there's no nieces, there's no nephews, there's no brothers, there's no sisters. When the mother and father sadly die, there's nobody to in their biological family. Maybe they have their own children or their own husband or wife. So we're really moving to a situation where that organic exposure to other generations from your own family is not always happening for many people.
We think our largest family party was 1937, pre-war and pre-Second World War, and everyone was then dispersed. Many of the people in Latvia, Lithuania were killed. Others went to the United States, to Germany, to Australia. And would you believe that our second biggest party was 3 months ago on Zoom? We pulled together everyone from across. And so this COVID crisis actually created the circumstances where we all went on video and had a big family party. And again, with the death of our older generation now, the 90-year-olds, we of the 60s and 50s, are going to be gathering our families and again going back to the bigger one. But I'm taking too much of your time. Rob,
No.
you are charismatic. You are infectiously optimistic. What is it that we at the Centre for Optimism can do to support the work and purpose that you're working towards?
Can you give me an all expenses paid trip to Australia in February?
Well, I don't think our budget goes to that. I don't know that our borders will be open in February, but let us have a think about how we can collaborate and make that happen.
I'm just kidding. I would be delighted to collaborate and stay in touch. And I think it's very important that an advantage of this COVID-19 crisis is that it's allowed a lot of people to reflect on their life, to engage in introspection, to think about where their life has been, where it is now, where they want to be in the future. It's separated a lot of people from the people, places, and activities that they love. And maybe that's given them a wake-up call and an awareness that we shouldn't take things for granted. So I'm kind of optimistic about the post-COVID-19 lifestyle and the post-COVID-19 world that we're going to live in. I feel this has really prompted many people to think deeply, to think about the wider things in life that are important, which are family, human relationships, meaning and purpose. It's not all about accruing big bucks in the bank account, and it's not all about having a bigger car or a bigger house or having status and impressing people. So I'm delighted to stay in touch and collaborate more. As you said in my introduction, I'm a honorary principal fellow at the University of Melbourne, so I have visited the city many times and hope to come back once COVID-19 is over, and really would like to work together with you and anyone who's trying to bring this hope and optimism to the world.
Rob, may I wish you a Merry Christmas, a wonderful, purposeful new year, and thank you for your generosity and time today.
Thank you so much, Victor. I'm happy to be here, and any other time, feel free to get in touch.
Well, we hope you enjoyed that episode of the Optimism Cafe as much as we did. Please get involved with the Centre for Optimism. Our website is on the screen, centreforoptimism.com. You can sign up for regular newsletters, you can join as a member to support us, and you will find a wealth of material to help you be more infectiously optimistic, to support both your own dreams and those of those around you, family, friends, colleagues. We wish you the best of days.